Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through time, back beyond the noise of the modern world, beyond the rush of centuries, to a place where the sun rises golden over endless stretches of sand, and a ribbon of blue water brings life to everything it touches. This is the story of ancient Egypt, a civilization that would endure for over 3,000 years, longer than the time between the birth of Christ and today. Imagine that 3 millennia of continuous culture, of kingdoms rising and falling like the rhythm of the Nile itself. And it all began with that river. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And he was right. Without this magnificent waterway flowing from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, there would be no Egypt as we know it. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood its banks, depositing rich, dark soil across the land. Soil so fertile that farmers could grow enough food to feed not just themselves, but priests, scribes, artists, and pharaohs. This predictable flooding created a surplus, and from that surplus civilization bloomed. The ancient Egyptians divided their year around this flooding. They had 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. Ake, the inundation when the Nile flooded, Parate, the growing season, when crops sprouted in that rich soil, and Shimu, the harvest, when they gathered what the gods had provided. This rhythm shaped everything, their calendar, their festivals, their very understanding of time itself. But let's go back even further to the beginning. Around 3100 BCE, a king named Narmer, sometimes called Menes, achieved something remarkable. He united the 2 separate kingdoms that had existed in the region. Lower Egypt in the north, in the fertile delta where the Nile splits into many streams before meeting the sea, and Upper Egypt in the south, the narrow strip of green flanking the river through the desert. This unification created the first dynasty of pharaohs, and with it, one of history's greatest civilizations was born. The word pharaoh itself is fascinating. It comes from the Egyptian term pharaoh, which literally means great house, originally referring not to the king himself, but to the royal palace. Over time, this term came to mean the king, the living embodiment of divine power on earth. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader. He was a god in human form, a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the deities. Speaking of gods, the ancient Egyptians had a rich and complex pantheon. They worshipped hundreds of deities, each governing different aspects of life and nature. There was Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark. Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth. Isis, the protective mother goddess. Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. And Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the dead. These weren't distant, unknowable gods. They were part of daily life, woven into every ritual, every decision, every breath. The Egyptians believed deeply in the afterlife, perhaps more than any other ancient civilization. They thought that death was not an ending, but a transition to another form of existence. To ensure a successful journey to the afterlife, the body had to be preserved. This is why they developed the elaborate practice of mummification. The process could take up to 70 days. First, they removed the internal organs, except for the heart, which was believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion. The brain was removed through the nose and discarded. They didn't think it was important. The body was then dried out using a type of salt called natron, wrapped in linen bandages, and placed in a decorated coffin. The wealthiest Egyptians might have several nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last. These mummies were placed in tombs filled with everything the deceased might need in the afterlife: food, furniture, jewelry, even servants, in the form of small figurines called ushabti, which were believed to come to life and serve the dead in the next world. The walls of tombs were covered with spells and instructions from the Book of the Dead, a collection of magical texts designed to guide the soul through the dangers of the underworld and into paradise. And paradise, for the ancient Egyptians, was a place called the Field of Reeds, a perfect reflection of Egypt itself, where the crops grew tall, the sun always shone, and there was no pain or suffering. But to reach it, the deceased had to pass a final test: the weighing of the heart. In this ceremony, the god Anubis would place the person's heart on one side of a scale, and on the other side, a feather, the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived a good and honest life, they could enter paradise. But if the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, a terrifying creature part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the soul would cease to exist. Let yourself rest in this ancient world, where the Nile flows eternal, where gods walk among mortals, and where even death is just another journey. Let your mind wander now to the great monuments, the structures that have stood for millennia, silent witnesses to the passage of time. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of the pyramids, those massive geometric mountains rising from the desert sands. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, is the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. For over 3,800 years, it was the tallest man-made structure on Earth, standing at an original height of 481 feet. Imagine the dedication required to build such a monument. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. Modern engineers still debate exactly how the ancient Egyptians accomplished this feat without modern machinery, a mystery that adds to the pyramid's eternal mystique. Contrary to popular belief, the pyramids were not built by slaves. Recent archaeological evidence from workers' villages near the pyramids shows that they were built by paid laborers, skilled workers who took pride in their craft. These workers were organized into teams with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. They received wages in the form of food, bread, beer, and onions mostly, and they were given proper burials when they died, suggesting they were respected members of society, not oppressed slaves. But the pyramids were just one part of a vast funerary complex. Each pyramid was accompanied by temples, causeways, and smaller pyramids for queens. And guarding the pyramids of Giza stands the Great Sphinx, a colossal limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a human, believed to represent the pharaoh Khafre. The Sphinx is 240 feet long and 66 feet high, carved from a single ridge of limestone. For centuries, it was buried up to its shoulders in sand, protecting it from the erosion that has worn away some of its features. including its nose, which was lost long before Napoleon's time, despite the popular myth. Now let your thoughts drift to the written word, to one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable gifts to civilization: hieroglyphics. The word comes from the Greek hieros, meaning sacred, and glyphian, meaning to carve. These weren't just simple pictures. They were a sophisticated writing system with over 700 different symbols. Some hieroglyphs represented sounds like letters in our alphabet. Others represented whole words or ideas. The ancient Egyptians used hieroglyphs for religious texts carved into temple walls and tombs, reserving them for the most important, sacred purposes. For everyday writing, scribes used two simpler scripts: hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphics, and later demotic, an even more simplified version. Scribes held a prestigious position in Egyptian society. While most Egyptians were farmers who couldn't read or write, scribes were educated in special schools attached to temples. They learned mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and of course, writing. A scribe could work his way up to become an important official, perhaps even vizier, the pharaoh's chief advisor. There was a saying in ancient Egypt: "Be a scribe and your body will be sleek, and your hand will be soft." The tools of a scribe were simple but elegant: a palette with cakes of black and red ink, made from soot and ochre, a pot of water, and brushes made from reeds with frayed ends. They wrote on papyrus, paper made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly along the Nile. The stems were cut into strips, laid out in 2 layers at right angles, then pressed and dried. The result was a smooth, durable writing surface that has preserved texts for thousands of years. In fact, the word paper comes from papyrus. For nearly 1,500 years after the fall of ancient Egypt, hieroglyphics remained a mystery, beautiful but unreadable symbols that no one could interpret. Then, in 1799, a French soldier in Napoleon's army discovered a black stone near the town of Rosetta. This stone, which would become known as the Rosetta Stone, contained the same text written in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphics at the top, demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. Because scholars could read ancient Greek, they finally had the key to unlock the hieroglyphic code. A brilliant French linguist named Jean-François Champollion spent years studying the stone and, in 1822, announced his breakthrough. The ancient writing could be read again after millennia of silence. Breathe deeply now, and let yourself relax even further as we continue through the sands of time. Ancient Egyptian society was highly structured, like a pyramid itself. At the very top sat the pharaoh, divine and absolute. Below him was the vizier, who managed the day-to-day running of the kingdom. Then came the nobles and priests, powerful men who controlled vast estates and temples. The priests didn't just perform religious ceremonies. They were also astronomers, doctors, and keepers of knowledge. Egyptian temples were more than places of worship. They were universities, hospitals, and astronomical observatories all in one. Below the priests were the scribes we mentioned, then the craftsmen and merchants, then the farmers who made up the vast majority of the population, and finally, at the bottom, the slaves. Though slavery in Egypt was quite different from later forms. Many slaves were prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt, and some could eventually earn or buy their freedom. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed more rights and freedoms than women in most other ancient civilizations. They could own property, run businesses, make wills, and even divorce their husbands. Some women became pharaohs themselves. The most famous is Cleopatra VII, but she was actually Greek, ruling at the very end of ancient Egypt's history. Earlier, there was Hatshepsut, who ruled during the New Kingdom around 1479 BCE. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen, and even wore the traditional false beard that pharaohs wore as a symbol of their divine authority. Under her rule, Egypt prospered, and she commissioned grand building projects, including her stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffs like an architectural prayer to the gods. Let these images of ancient grandeur wash over you. The towering pyramids, the mysterious hieroglyphs, the powerful pharaohs. As you sink deeper and deeper into peaceful rest. Now, let us journey to the Valley of the Kings, a remote, sun-baked canyon on the west bank of the Nile, across from the ancient city of Thebes. Here, in this barren landscape of limestone cliffs, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom chose to be buried, abandoning the pyramids of their ancestors. They carved their tombs deep into the rock, hoping that secrecy would protect their mummies and treasures from grave robbers where the obvious pyramids had failed. 63 tombs have been discovered in the Valley of the Kings, though surely more remain hidden beneath the sand and stone. Most were plundered in ancient times, their gold stolen, their mummies disturbed. But in 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter made a discovery that would captivate the world. After years of fruitless searching, funded by Lord Carnarvon, Carter's team uncovered a staircase buried beneath debris from another tomb. At the bottom lay a sealed door bearing the name of a pharaoh who had been almost forgotten by history, Tutankhamun. King Tutankhamun, often called King Tut, became pharaoh when he was only about 9 years old and died mysteriously around the age of 18 or 19. His tomb was small and modest compared to other royal tombs, suggesting he died unexpectedly before a grander tomb could be prepared. But what made his tomb extraordinary was that it had remained virtually intact for over 3,000 years. When Carter peered through a small hole in the doorway and held up a candle, Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything. Carter's reply became legendary. Yes, wonderful things. Inside, they found over 5,000 objects, golden chariots, jeweled chests, ornate furniture, alabaster vases, and most stunning of all, the pharaoh's coffins nested one inside another, the innermost made of solid gold weighing over 200 pounds. Tutankhamun's mummy wore a magnificent burial mask of gold inlaid with lapis lazuli and other precious stones, an image that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. The discovery revealed details about Egyptian burial practices, art, and daily life that had been lost for millennia. Let your mind drift now to the concept of Ma'at, a word that has no perfect translation in English. It means truth, justice, harmony, balance, and cosmic order all at once. Ma'at was both a concept and a goddess, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head. The ancient Egyptians believed that Ma'at held the universe together. When pharaohs ruled justly, When priests performed their rituals correctly, when people lived honestly, Ma'at was maintained. But chaos, lies, and injustice threatened to bring isfit, disorder, which could unravel the fabric of reality itself. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at. Every morning, in temples throughout Egypt, priests would perform a ritual called awakening the god. They would enter the innermost sanctuary, break the seal on the shrine containing the god's statue, wash and dress the statue, offer it food and incense, and then seal the shrine again. This daily ritual wasn't just symbolic. They believed it actually nourished the gods and kept the cosmic order intact. Without these rituals, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, and chaos would consume the world. Ancient Egyptians were skilled physicians for their time. Medical papyri that have survived show a surprising understanding of anatomy and disease. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but probably copied from much older texts, describes 48 surgical cases and their treatments, including head injuries, broken bones, and tumors. The Ebers Papyrus lists over 800 remedies for various ailments. Egyptian doctors understood that the heart pumped blood through vessels, a remarkable insight for the ancient world. They performed surgeries, set broken bones, and even did dental work. Archaeological evidence shows some mummies with dental bridges and fillings. However, their medicine was a mixture of practical observation and magical belief. They might prescribe honey to treat wounds, which actually works because honey has antibacterial properties. But they might also prescribe spells and amulets. Disease was often thought to be caused by angry gods or evil spirits, so treatment combined herbs and surgery with prayers and incantations. The god Imhotep, who was originally a real person, an architect who designed the first step pyramid, was later deified and became the god of medicine and healing. Relax your shoulders, let your breathing slow, as we explore the foods and flavors of this ancient land. The ancient Egyptian diet was surprisingly varied and healthy. The foundation was bread and beer. Yes, beer. Both were made from barley or emmer wheat, and beer was a staple food, not just a recreational drink. It was thick, nutritious, and slightly sweet, consumed by everyone from pharaohs to laborers. In fact, workers building the pyramids received a daily ration of about 4 liters of beer. Egyptian beer was so important that there were at least 17 types, and the hieroglyph for meal literally shows a beer jug and a loaf of bread. Beyond bread and beer, they ate fish from the Nile, though some types were considered sacred and forbidden. They grew vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, and cucumbers. They kept geese, ducks, and later chickens for eggs and meat. Wealthy Egyptians enjoyed beef, though cattle were expensive to raise in the desert climate, so meat was more common at festivals and feasts. They sweetened their food with honey and dates, as they had no sugar, and they loved their garlic and onions. So much so that there's a record of workers on the pyramids going on strike when their onion rations were reduced. The ancient Egyptians invented many things we still use today. They created one of the first calendars, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra festival days, giving them a 365-day year. This calendar was so accurate that it formed the basis for the Julian calendar, which in turn influenced our modern Gregorian calendar. They invented the 24-hour day, dividing daylight and darkness each into 12 hours. Though the length of an hour varied with the seasons since days were longer in summer and shorter in winter. They were also pioneers in mathematics and engineering. They understood geometry well enough to calculate the area of circles and the volume of pyramids. They used a decimal system and had symbols for numbers up to 1 million. The Moscow mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1850 BCE, shows they could calculate the volume of a truncated pyramid. A complex mathematical feat. All of this mathematical knowledge served practical purposes. Surveying fields after floods, calculating taxes on grain harvests, and of course, designing their magnificent monuments. Feel the warm Egyptian sun on your face. Hear the gentle lapping of the Nile. As you rest deeper still in this ancient world of wonders, let us turn our attention now to the animals of ancient Egypt, creatures both mundane and sacred, woven into the very fabric of daily life and religious belief. The Egyptians shared their world with a remarkable array of wildlife, and many animals were considered sacred manifestations of the gods themselves. Cats held a special place in Egyptian hearts and homes. They were valued for their practical service, hunting mice and rats that threatened grain stores. But they also became deeply sacred. The goddess Batet, protector of the home and bringer of joy, was depicted as a cat or a woman with a cat's head. Killing a cat, even accidentally, could be punishable by death. When a beloved cat died, family members would shave their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Cats were mummified and buried with great ceremony, and in one ancient cat cemetery at Bubastis, archaeologists discovered over 300,000 cat mummies. This shows just how deeply the Egyptians revered these graceful creatures. But cats were not the only sacred animals. Crocodiles were associated with the god Sobuk and were kept in temple pools, pampered with food and jewelry. Some were even mummified after death. Ibises, elegant wading birds with curved beaks, were sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Millions of ibis mummies have been found at sacred sites. Bulls, especially those with specific markings, were worshipped as the Apis bull, believed to be a living manifestation of the god Ptah. When an Apis bull died, all of Egypt mourned, and the bull was mummified with the same care as a pharaoh. Even scarab beetles held profound meaning. These small beetles roll balls of dung across the sand to lay their eggs in, and the Egyptians saw in this humble act a powerful symbol. They believed the scarab represented Khepri, the god of the rising sun, who rolled the sun across the sky each day like the beetle rolling its dung ball. Scarab amulets became powerful symbols of rebirth and transformation, often placed over the heart of a mummy to ensure resurrection in the afterlife. Now let your mind drift to the great temples, architectural marvels that still stand today, testaments to devotion and engineering prowess. The temple complex at Karnak, dedicated primarily to the god Ammonius-Ra, is the largest religious building ever constructed. It covers over 200 acres. That's larger than some ancient cities. Construction began around 2000 BCE and continued for nearly 2,000 years, with each pharaoh adding new structures, expanding and embellishing what came before. Walking through Karnak would have been an overwhelming experience. The Great Hypostyle Hall alone contains 134 massive columns, the tallest reaching 70 feet high and so thick that it would take 6 people with arms outstretched to encircle one. These columns are covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphs and scenes of pharaohs making offerings to the gods. The ceiling was originally painted blue with golden stars, creating the illusion of the night sky. Shafts of sunlight would filter through high windows, illuminating the painted reliefs in a play of light and shadow that must have seemed magical, divine. Temple walls throughout Egypt tell stories carved in stone. At Abu Simbel, Ramesses II, perhaps the most prolific builder of all pharaohs, carved 4 colossal statues of himself into a cliff face, each 67 feet tall. The temple was positioned so precisely that twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the rising sun would shine through the entrance and illuminate the sanctuary deep inside, lighting up statues of the gods and Ramesses himself. Modern engineers, when relocating the entire temple in the 1960s to save it from flooding by the Aswan Dam, managed to preserve the solar alignment, an engineering feat matching the ancient wonder. Breathe slowly, deeply, as we explore the beauty rituals of this elegant civilization. Ancient Egyptians, both men and women, took great care with their appearance. They valued cleanliness and beauty, seeing them as signs of respect for the gods and for oneself. They bathed regularly, a luxury in the ancient world, using natron as soap and perfumed oils to moisturize their skin against the harsh desert sun. Wealthy Egyptians would bathe multiple times a day and anoint themselves with fragrant oils made from flowers, herbs, and resins. Both men and women wore makeup, and this wasn't mere vanity. It served practical purposes too. They lined their eyes with kohl, a dark powder made from galena or soot mixed with oil. This dramatic eye makeup, so iconic in images of ancient Egypt, wasn't just decorative. The dark color reduced glare from the intense sun, much like modern athletes wear black under their eyes. The ingredients also had antibacterial properties that helped prevent eye infections, which were common in the dusty climate. Green eyeshadow, made from malachite, was worn on the lower lids, while the upper lids and lashes were darkened with the black kohl. Close your eyes and imagine the clothing of ancient Egypt, garments perfectly suited to the climate, elegant in their simplicity. The Egyptians wore linen, made from flax plants that grew along the Nile. Cotton would not arrive in Egypt until much later, so linen was the fabric of choice for everyone, from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself. The difference was in the quality. Coarse linen for workers, linen so fine and sheer it was almost transparent for the wealthy. The weaving of linen was so refined that some royal garments had a thread count of over 200 threads per inch, comparable to high-quality modern bed sheets. The finest linen was called royal linen or woven air because of its incredible lightness and delicacy. White was the preferred color, symbolizing purity, though garments could be pleated, beaded, or decorated with colorful patterns. Men typically wore a simple kilt or loincloth, while women wore straight, form-fitting dresses with shoulder straps. In the heat of the Egyptian sun, less was definitely more. Now let us turn to one of the most fascinating periods in Egyptian history, the reign of the so-called heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Around 1353 BCE, this pharaoh did something unprecedented. He abandoned the traditional Egyptian gods and declared that there was only one god worthy of worship: Aten, the sun disk. He closed temples to other gods, erased their names from monuments, and even changed his own name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a newly built city called Akhetaten, which means horizon of Aten, today known as Amarna. He revolutionized Egyptian art as well. Traditional Egyptian art was formal and idealized, but Akhenaten's artists created a new style that was more naturalistic, even exaggerated. Images of Akhenaten show him with an elongated face, full lips, a long neck, and a prominent belly, features that appear in depictions of his entire family, including his famous wife, Nefertiti, whose painted limestone bust is one of the most recognizable images from ancient Egypt. This religious revolution didn't last. After Akhenaten's death, the priests of the old gods regained power. His successor, a young boy who would become Tutankhamun, was pressured to abandon Aten worship and restore the traditional gods. Akhetaten was abandoned, and later pharaohs tried to erase Akhenaten from history, considering him a heretic. His name was removed from king lists, his monuments were dismantled, and his city was left to crumble in the desert, which, ironically, preserved it beautifully for modern archaeologists. Let your breathing slow as we explore the love of games and leisure in this ancient culture. The ancient Egyptians enjoyed their leisure time, and they played many games that would seem familiar to us today. One of the most popular was Senet, a board game played on a grid of 30 squares. Players moved pieces according to the throw of sticks or knuckle bones, trying to get all their pieces off the board first. But Senet was more than just entertainment. It had religious significance too. The game was thought to represent the journey of the soul through the afterlife, and paintings in tombs often show the deceased playing Senet, symbolizing their passage to the afterlife. Game boards have been found in tombs, including Tutankhamun's, ensuring the pharaoh could play in the next world. Children played with toys remarkably similar to modern ones. Dolls with movable limbs and wigs, wooden animals with wheels, leather balls stuffed with reeds or papyrus, spinning tops, and pull toys. They played games like leapfrog, tug-of-war, and juggling. Swimming in the Nile was popular, though one had to be cautious of crocodiles and hippos. Hunting and fishing were enjoyed by the wealthy, both for sport and for food. Wall paintings show nobles in marshes, standing in reed boats, throwing sticks at flocks of birds, accompanied by their families in festive scenes of abundance and joy. Music and dance filled Egyptian life with rhythm and celebration. Musicians played harps, lyres, lutes, drums, tambourines, and flutes. The harp was especially beloved, with some harps standing over 6 feet tall, elaborately decorated with gold and precious stones. Singers and dancers performed at religious festivals, at banquets, and at funerals. Tomb paintings show dancers in graceful poses, musicians concentrating on their instruments, and guests clapping in time with the music. Music was believed to please the gods, and certain instruments and songs were part of religious rituals. Now, drift further back to one of Egypt's greatest mysteries: the construction techniques of the pyramids. While we've touched on the pyramids before, let's explore how these monuments were actually built. Recent discoveries have shed light on methods that seemed almost magical to earlier generations. Archaeologists have found evidence of wooden and copper tools, including copper chisels and saws that were used to cut the softer limestone blocks. For the harder granite, workers used dolerite pounders, extremely hard stones used to pound and shape the granite through sheer persistence and force. They didn't have iron tools. Iron working wouldn't arrive in Egypt until much later. So everything was accomplished with copper, stone, and wood, along with tremendous skill and organization. The blocks were likely moved using sledges, wooden sleds that workers pulled over sand. But here's where it gets interesting. Experiments have shown that pouring water on the sand in front of the sledge reduces friction dramatically, making it much easier to pull heavy loads. Ancient Egyptian paintings actually show workers pouring liquid in front of a sledge carrying a massive statue, which supports this theory. The blocks were then hauled up ramps to be set in place. These ramps might have spiraled around the pyramid, or been straight ramps that were extended as the pyramid grew taller, or perhaps a combination of methods was used. The precision of the pyramids is astounding. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within just 1 inch across its entire 756-foot width. The sides are aligned almost perfectly to true north, south, east, and west, with an error of less than 1/15 of a degree. This required sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. The builders used the stars, particularly the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon, to determine true north with remarkable accuracy. Rest now in the shadows of these great monuments, feeling the timeless presence of a civilization that reached toward eternity. Let your mind wander now to the concept of the Egyptian soul. For the ancient Egyptians believed that a person was not a single, simple entity, but rather a complex being made up of multiple spiritual components. Understanding this helps us grasp why they went to such elaborate lengths to preserve the body and prepare for the afterlife. The Egyptians believed each person had at least 5 spiritual elements. The Ka was the life force, a spiritual double created at birth that lived on after death and needed food and drink, which is why offerings were left at tombs. The Ba was closer to what we might call personality or soul, depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between the tomb and the afterlife. The Ak was the transformed, glorified spirit that lived in the afterlife after successful mummification and proper rituals. Then there was the Ren, your name. Incredibly important because as long as your name was spoken and remembered, you continued to exist. This is why defacing someone's name on monuments was considered the worst possible punishment. It could destroy them even in the afterlife. Finally, the Shut was your shadow, believed to contain part of your essence. This complex view of the soul explains why tomb inscriptions would often include a plea, "May you speak my name to the living." As long as someone said your name, read your inscriptions, or remembered you, your soul continued to exist in the afterlife. It's a beautiful thought that memory and legacy are literally life-giving. Now drift with me to the banks of the Nile during the season of Ake, the inundation. This annual flooding was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, and predicting it was crucial. The Egyptians developed a system of nilometers, structures built along the river with marked columns or stairs that measured the water level. Officials would monitor these carefully, because the height of the flood determined everything. A flood that was too low meant drought, famine, and hardship. Too high and villages could be destroyed, lives lost. But just the right flood, about 16 cubits or roughly 27 feet above the normal level, meant prosperity. Based on the nilometer readings, scribes would calculate how much tax each farmer should pay that year. If the flood was poor, taxes would be reduced. This system was so important that one of the pharaoh's titles was Lord of the Two Lands, referring to the fertile black land created by the Nile's deposits, and the red land of the desert beyond. Breathe deeply, and let us explore the remarkable tale of the Rosetta Stone's journey. After its discovery in 1799, the Rosetta Stone had quite an adventure. When the French forces in Egypt surrendered to the British in 1801, the stone was claimed by the British as spoils of war. It was shipped to England and placed in the British Museum in 1802, where it remains today, though Egypt has repeatedly requested its return. The stone itself is a fragment of a larger stele, a ceremonial decree issued in 196 BCE during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek pharaohs ruled Egypt. The decree praised the young pharaoh Ptolemy V, and it was written in 3 scripts so that priests who read hieroglyphics, officials who used Demotic, and the Greek-speaking rulers could all read it. The man who finally cracked the code, Jean-François Champollion, was a linguistic prodigy. He could read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and several other languages by his teenage years. He became obsessed with hieroglyphics and studied the Rosetta Stone for years. The breakthrough came when he realized that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic. They also represented sounds like letters in an alphabet. By matching the hieroglyphic cartouches, oval frames containing royal names, with the Greek names on the stone, he began to decode the phonetic values of individual hieroglyphs. His announcement in 1822 opened the door to understanding thousands of years of Egyptian texts. Let your thoughts float now to the daily life of an ordinary Egyptian farmer. Far from the splendor of pharaohs and pyramids, most Egyptians lived in small villages along the Nile, in houses made of mud brick. These homes were simple but practical, with thick walls that kept the interior cool during the scorching days and warm during cool nights. Roofs were flat, and families often slept there during hot summer nights to catch any breeze. The houses had small windows set high in the walls to provide ventilation while maintaining privacy and keeping out the intense sun. A typical farmer's day began at dawn. After a simple breakfast, perhaps bread dipped in beer with an onion, he would head to the fields. During the growing season, he tended crops of wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. Harvest time was intense labor, with the entire family working together to bring in the crops before the next flood. After harvest came the tax collector, who would claim the pharaoh's share of the grain. What remained would feed the family for the year and provide seed for the next planting. Farmers used simple but effective tools. Wooden plows pulled by oxen bronze or copper sickles for harvesting, and wooden hoes. They developed an irrigation system of canals and basins that captured and distributed the floodwaters, allowing them to water their fields even when the Nile was low. This system, called basin irrigation, was so efficient that it was used in Egypt for thousands of years, right up until the modern era. Family was the center of life. Marriages were usually arranged, often between cousins to keep property within families, though love matches certainly occurred. Wedding ceremonies were simple. Essentially, the couple began living together and that constituted marriage. Divorce was possible and relatively straightforward, though it carried social stigma. Children were treasured, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly high, as it was throughout the ancient world. Amulets and spells were used to protect mothers and babies, invoking gods like Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Let these scenes of ordinary life wash over you. The smell of fresh bread baking in clay ovens, the chatter of children playing in dusty streets, the lowing of cattle returning from the fields as the sun sets golden over the eternal river. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, let us explore the remarkable journey of the Egyptian language itself. Ancient Egyptian is one of the oldest recorded languages in human history, with written records spanning over 4,000 years. It belongs to the Afroasiatic language family, related distantly to Arabic, Hebrew, and Berber languages. Over its long history, the language evolved through several distinct stages. Old Egyptian was spoken during the Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids. Middle Egyptian, considered the classical form of the language, flourished during the Middle Kingdom and continued to be used for religious and formal texts long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life. Much like Latin in medieval Europe, Late Egyptian emerged during the New Kingdom, and then came Demotic, the language of the common people in the later periods. Finally, Coptic developed after Egypt became part of the Greek and Roman worlds, written using the Greek alphabet with a few added letters for sounds that didn't exist in Greek. Coptic is still used today as the liturgical language of the Coptic Christian Church in Egypt, making it the last surviving form of the ancient Egyptian language. The death of the ancient Egyptian language and culture was gradual. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, Greek became the language of power and administration. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed was Greek, though they adopted Egyptian customs and presented themselves as pharaohs. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was actually the first of her dynasty to even learn the Egyptian language. Her predecessors had spoken only Greek. Drift now to the fascinating world of Egyptian astronomy. The ancient Egyptians were keen observers of the night sky, and their astronomical knowledge served both practical and religious purposes. They identified 5 planets that they could see with the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, though they understood them as wandering stars rather than as worlds like Earth. The heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet, was of enormous importance. This is when the star becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before sunrise after a period of being hidden by the sun's glare. In Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius occurred around mid-July and coincided almost perfectly with the beginning of the Nile's annual flood. The Egyptians used this celestial event to predict the inundation and to mark the beginning of their new year. The goddess Sopdet was associated with this star, and her appearance heralded the life-giving floods. They divided the night sky into 36 groups of stars called decans. Each decan would rise above the horizon at dawn for 10 days, then be replaced by the next decan. This system allowed them to tell time at night and formed the basis of their division of the night into 12 hours. During the day, they used shadow clocks and water clocks, vessels with holes that allowed water to drip out at a steady rate, with marks inside showing the passing hours. Breathe slowly and let us journey to the subject of warfare and military might. Egypt was not always a peaceful kingdom. Throughout its long history, it faced invasions and fought wars to expand or defend its borders. The Egyptian army evolved significantly over the millennia. During the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the military was relatively small, comprised mainly of conscripted farmers during times of need. But during the New Kingdom, Egypt developed a professional standing army with career soldiers, a necessity as Egypt expanded its empire and faced more sophisticated enemies. The introduction of the chariot around 1600 BCE revolutionized Egyptian warfare. Chariots were light, fast, and deadly, pulled by 2 horses and manned by a driver and an archer. Egyptian composite bows, made from wood, horn, and sinew glued together, were powerful weapons that could pierce armor at considerable distances. The pharaoh himself was expected to lead his army into battle, and many pharaohs, particularly Thutmose III and Ramesses II, were celebrated as great military commanders. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire, is one of the most well-documented battles of the ancient world. Both sides claimed victory, and Ramesses had the battle commemorated on temple walls throughout Egypt in dramatic, propagandistic reliefs. The reality was probably more of a stalemate, but the battle eventually led to the world's first known peace treaty. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, signed around 1259 BCE. Copies were made in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, and a copy of this treaty hangs in the United Nations building in New York as a symbol of ancient diplomacy. Let your mind rest now on the concept of time as the Egyptians understood it. The Egyptians had 2 concepts of time, Nihe and Jet. Nihe was cyclical time, the eternal repetition of cycles like the daily journey of the sun, the annual flood of the Nile, the seasons, birth and death and rebirth. This was time as an endless circle, always returning to its beginning. Jet, on the other hand, was linear time, the eternal, unchanging perfection of the afterlife and the realm of the gods. These 2 concepts existed together, intertwined, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of time's nature. Monuments were built to last for Jet, eternity in its unchanging sense. The pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, all were meant to defy Nihe, the decay and change of cyclical time, and exist forever in perfect, eternal Jet. When a pharaoh built a temple and carved his name upon it, he was asserting his place in both types of time, his mortal life in Nihe and his eternal existence in Jet. This is why the ancient Egyptians built with such permanence. They constructed their homes and palaces from mud brick, which would crumble and be rebuilt generation after generation, participating in the cycle of Nihe. But their tombs and temples were built from stone, limestone, sandstone, granite, materials meant to last forever. The living dwelt in the world of change. The dead and the gods inhabited the realm of eternity. Rest peacefully in this understanding of time. Both the flowing river of moments and the still, perfect eternity beyond it